Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the EvoPodcast, a podcast where we discuss everything study-related, work, and I guess how to improve in general. I'm Sachin, Head of VCE Chemistry.
And I'm Dulitha, Head of VCE Biology at Evo Academics. Now, the focus of today's episode is how crucial the mental game is for your VCE success and how many students often underestimate this fact.
Today, we're going to be discussing how important it is to start your day the right way, as well as why we're all human and can't keep working like machines all the time. We're also going to be discussing why it's important that we create an identity for ourselves beyond just marks alone. And then finally, I suppose, how do we take control of things that we can actually have influence on and try not to blame the system around us?
Okay, so we might start off by first exploring how much of an impact the start of the day has for everything that comes after it. What are your thoughts on this, Sachin?
Yeah, so this is something which I think is really important for people to get a hold of. I know it changed the way that I started feeling, especially throughout the days. What I feel a lot of people do is in the morning of the day, when you don't have much focus on what you're doing, a lot of people can start to do whatever feels easiest. So that can be things like doom scrolling social media.
Yep.
It can be things like watching a TV show, perhaps playing a video game, for example. And I think at the surface, under that concept is the idea that any time in the day is the same. But I think there's something particularly important about mornings. I think in the morning is a time for focus, not distraction. And if we start the day off with distraction, then I think it just frazzles our mind and we will struggle to focus anywhere else. I think another important thing to take note of is morning time is often a period of dead time for a lot of people because they'll be traveling by public transport to university or to school, or they may be in transit, or it's kind of a busy time in the morning. And I think a lot of people resort to, for example, just going on their phone or perhaps not knowing how to use that time productively. So I think we've all heard before that what would be a really good solution to using our mornings well is sometimes having some silence early in the day, not necessarily having to do something. I think also reading, right? Some people also like to, for example, do flashcards for school while they're on public transport. And also, I think talking with other people, particularly if you have friends, I think that take the same public transport as you is a really good way, certainly much better than using phones. And I think there's a couple of reasons why this is. First of all, I think it's really important to be intentional about why we're doing a particular activity, especially in the morning. So if you enter social media, for example, wanting to just pass away the time or to give your mind something to look at, that activity doesn't end very well because the intention wasn't good to start off with. Likewise, when people binge watch TV shows on their phone, there's nothing inherently wrong with watching TV shows. But I think when you are watching it with the intention of just trying to distract yourself, then that's when it can turn bad. Secondly, I also think that period in the morning is actually a really good time for boredom and creativity. I think when we have a bit of silence in the morning, what that does is it allows us to just think a little bit. Certain thoughts come to us that we probably wouldn't have noticed before. Also, if our phones are not buried inside, if our eyes are not buried inside our phones, we begin to notice small things around us, like off in the distance, maybe there's some commotion going on, or maybe you're noticing someone doing something while on the train, or while you're driving, you just have a certain thought, or you become more observant of nature. I think there's so many things that boredom is actually really important and quite useful, actually. I think that's where creativity comes from. It gives us new ideas. So I think part of the reason people default to using their phone in the mornings is because they can't deal with that boredom. There's a bit of it feels uncomfortable to have certain thoughts come up and we just want to focus our minds. But if we can get through that initial period, I think starting our mornings with a bit of emptiness and less stimulation is such a key. I wouldn't even call it a hack. I would call it a long-term sustainable benefit. I think it's something that doesn't erode over time. So starting your mornings well is absolutely key. whether you're a student in school or in uni.
So now for a VC student who might be thinking, cool, I don't want to go on Instagram, I don't want to waste my time, let's say when they're traveling to school on the train, what are some things that they can do instead of just throwing away that time?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's particularly good when you have that period of time for English subjects. I think if you are studying like mainstream English, then perhaps reading the book that you've been assigned or even some analysis of that book, just when you have that time to soak it in, can be quite useful. I know if you do English language, for example, reading the news might actually be quite useful because you'll need to use contemporary examples in your essays that you ultimately write at the end of the year, and it can be a good time to collect those examples. I also think, we said earlier about using flashcards for any sort of content-based subjects that you would normally do at home. I mean, this is like a perfect time to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
And then finally, I think if you really don't want to do anything, I think it's better to just put your phone away and just not do anything at all. I think the really bad situation comes where you're like, I don't want to do schoolwork, but I want to do something. And then that's when we start opening all these apps. So just either using it for study or trying to be without it at all.
So just continuing on from that point, Sachin, I feel like a common thing that many students struggle with is they always have this mindset of wanting to maximize everything in terms of their study time, study hours. And they end up forgetting that they're not just a robot built to just purely study, and that they're actually a human being who has other needs in order to survive and actually be happy. Now, how does this actually present itself with students? The mindset that some students have is, I need to study more and more and more and more and more in order to get this certain goal. And if I don't continue pushing myself and increasing my study hours by X amount each week, I'm on a path to failure. That's what some students think. Now, as a result of attempting to live life this way, what ends up happening is that they sacrifice all these other things that are actually important for a student and any human being, right? So things like sleep, things like their own physical health, things like socialization with their friends and their family. Those things are very common aspects that students think that it's fine to sacrifice for their success in VCE. But I would argue, and I'm sure you would agree as well, that these things are actually critical in contributing to your success. So things like sleep, if you're sleep deprived, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how much you've studied, you're not going to be able to think straight, right? If you've neglected your physical health, well, and you get unwell, you can't sit your SAC, you can't do your exam, right? It's not going to happen. It doesn't matter how much you know. And things like your family and your friends, they will be with you far longer than VCE will be around, right? And it's super important, even as you go into your careers, when you go into university, you're a human being, right? We live in a society. You need to learn how to balance your academics and also all those other things that are important to exist as a human. And that includes socialization, right? So students who end up going down this path, what ends up happening is that they feel constantly tired, they feel constantly burnt out, and they lose that sort of spark or that passion that they once had to study, right? They started off the year really, really strong. They're like, I know I want to get this done. This is my goal. This is my plan to achieve it. But it's simply unsustainable to maintain that level of hours worked and that level of sacrifice for 365 days, right? Or whatever, 10 months, the school year, right? And many students, the reason they do this is they feel guilty at the end of the day, right? They're like, oh, I want to, I don't know, go outside, get some fresh air. I want to go on a run. I want to go for a swim. I want to go to the gym, whatever, right? But they're like, oh, if I do this, that means I don't care about VCE, right? Or that means I don't care about my study score. So it's sort of like this endless sort of loop that you're in, right? You want to do this, but then you feel like that's sort of cheating yourself or giving up on yourself. So then you don't do it, but then you feel worse and you're like, I got to do more.
It's just a cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just never ending. So the first step to breaking out of that cycle is simply acknowledging that, hey, okay, all these things are important in making me a well-rounded student and a well-rounded human. Now, speaking a bit about my own experience, I sort of did fall into this trap as well at the start of year 11 when I first went into VCE. Because year 9 and 10, I had a blast. That was like super fun, super fun years. Not much sort of responsibility, nothing too serious going on. But then when VC started, I was like, okay, cool. Got to sort of lock in a bit here. Things are getting serious. But in those initial weeks leading up to sort of the first biosec I did bio in year 11, I found that I was cutting out a lot of things that would give me happiness and joy, right? So I used to play tennis back in high school. So leading up to the SAC, some of like the team training sessions, I was like, hey, don't know if I can make it to this. And I sort of skipped out on that stuff. Things like chatting with my brother and messing around with him, that brought me a lot of joy, brings me a lot of joy to this day as well. That sort of got cut out as well. I'd just be in my room, just doing practice questions, drawing diagrams, correcting them. And the closer I got to SAC day, the worse and worse I felt, right? Which doesn't really make sense because I've done all this work. I should feel good, right? I should feel confident going in, but it was the complete opposite. And I thought, why is this happening? Why am I feeling like this? I should feel great going into the first SAC. And that's when I realized that all these things that I had neglected actually helped me be a good student, right? And it's about finding that balance between hours studied and hours focusing on those other aspects, right? So what's the ultimate solution to this problem? And it's pretty simple. It's just realizing, hey, I'm not a machine, I'm not a robot, I can't sit here and study 24/7. And realizing and identifying these things are important to me. My friends are important, my family is important, my hobby is important, my co-curricular is important, and actually planning your study time around those things, right? Treat them as non-negotiables, right? Yes, your study is important. I'm not saying you shouldn't study, of course. Of course you got to study, but also blocking out time to do those other things, regardless of what happens, right? Because if you think about it, let's say when you're older, you have a family, right? Yes, you got to go to work, but you also have a family and like kids at home, right? You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to work. Too bad. Don't care about my son. Don't care about my daughter or whatever. That doesn't work, right? So same thing. You need to learn those skills of balancing all those different commitments you have to make sure that holistically you're performing well in all aspects.
So we often hear for VCE students that mental health is prioritized a lot. How do you think physical health plays into that too?
Yeah, for sure. So physical health, of course, crucial aspect of high performance all in all, and just in terms of your general health, right? Now, how do VC students often neglect their physical health? I think the first thing that gets thrown in the bin is really sleep, right? Especially for high performers, that they feel like I can still function on less hours of sleep, and it means I can do more in the day. So why wouldn't I do that? Now, the issue with this is being sleep deprived, whether or not you really feel the fatigue the next day, you aren't functioning at your optimal level, right? If you're on like 4 hours of sleep, there is no way that is your true capacity, right? It's only once you properly fix up your sleep and you are consistent with it that you realize, oh, wow, hey, there's a whole nother gear in this car. I can go even faster. I can achieve more. There's more potential that I hadn't unlocked before. Yeah. So sleep is a big thing to not ignore, because functioning during school time is very important. You don't want to just be drowsy, falling asleep in class, and you want to be cognitively switched on. So sleep's huge. Now, physical activity, we sort of touched on a bit before. So going outside, touching grass, exercising, going to the gym, swimming, tennis, doing whatever co-curriculars you're doing, right? Keeping that up is also huge. One, not only because it's good for just in terms of your general health and fitness, it's also an outlet, right? Some of these things are also sort of social activities, right? So like tennis, you play with a team, or footy, or whatever you play, right? Social activity. The other big thing that many students neglect is nutrition. Now, the way I see this popping up is with breakfast, especially, right? So many students have told me, hey, I skip breakfast. Should I change this? Should I keep going? Is this an issue? Now, for me personally, I had been conditioned since I was like 5 years old to never skip breakfast, ever. Like my mum would literally not let me leave the house to go to school if I hadn't eaten breakfast. It might be like, I might be running 30 minutes late. She wouldn't care. She's like, nah, you're not leaving. So it had always been a habit for me. Always eat breakfast. Always eat breakfast. But now that I'm older and I'm like looking back on it, like why was she so big of me eating breakfast? Like I could still go the day without eating. Why was it important? And once again, it ties back to that concept of being switched on during school. Your brain is a very energy intensive organ, right? Needs a lot of nutrients to keep it going. And if it doesn't have those nutrients, no matter how switched on you think you are, like I said before, there's that extra gear still left that you haven't actually unlocked yet, right? So being well fueled, having that nutrition in you right from the start of the day allows you to actually make the most out of school time. Meaning when your teacher's teaching you something, you can take in that information better, right? Or if you're doing your own private study, you're using that time more optimally. And what does that mean? Well, that means you have more time later on in the day to do the other things you got to do, right? So instead of functioning at 70% of your capacity and having to drag out your study time for the whole day, you can function 100% right from the start if you get your sleep right and if you get your nutrition right, meaning you can spend time with your friends, you can spend time with your family, you can do your co-curriculars, and you can actually still enjoy your life even though you're in VCE, right? Being in VCE doesn't mean you need to just suffer throughout the whole year. That's not a thing, right? Students think that, okay, now it's year 11, now it's year 12. I must be really serious. I must have no fun this year. Not true, not true. It's possible to do everything and still excel in all those things if you have these fundamentals right.
Leading on from that, Dulitha, I think that point you mentioned about not having to suffer in year 12 is particularly important because I think a lot of people make their identity such that they feel like the only way to live up to that identity is to suffer.
For sure.
So let's break this down a little bit. So I feel like inherently, since students are in school, there's not much else going in their lives. Like school is a big part of life. We often tie our self-worth and identity to school, to our marks, to what other students and our peers think about us. I think that works quite well at the time because it's all we can see, but it can actually be quite damaging, especially if things go badly, right? I often see students come to me after a bad SAC and they appear dejected, right? And it's funny, looking back, you go like, oh, it's one setback, like we can overcome it. But at the time, the SAC is a huge element of your life. So when you tie your identity to, I think, marks or to assessments, that not only influences how you feel, but I think it also changes your behaviors. For example, when you study with almost like a voice in the back of your head that's constantly like, oh, you're not good enough. Like if you don't get this question right, or oh, there's a mark gone. What's going to happen on the exam? Like this little voice eats away at you. And I think it's really important to stress for everyone that you need to try and break away from that as quickly and as early as possible. Because if you don't, can guarantee that if it doesn't appear in school, there will come a time where you will simply be out of your depth and your identity will come crashing down. So how can we fix this? I think a really simple step that almost anyone will be able to come up with, but which most people don't do because it's actually quite hard, is to write down what's actually valuable to you. Now, when I say valuable, I don't mean things, I don't mean objects, I don't mean outcomes necessarily. I mean, what behaviors and processes do you value? And I think this is really important because often we have things like social media that like glamorize, this word success, like whatever that means, right? It means different things to different people. Often we look at our friends and we go, oh, they're doing something cool. Like maybe I should do that as well. I think it's really important to sit down and, this takes repetition, right? No one's going to know what they want like in the first sitting, but over a course of, a couple of months or a couple of weeks, try and figure out what do I actually like? What consistently gives me joy and fulfillment? And what consistently do I feel guilty or inadequate after doing? I think it's equally important to stress that this should not come from other people. And I know particularly for VCE students, often those other people can be your parents. And this particularly includes career choice, right? Like the typical, medicine, law, engineering. Like if you're picking a field, it can be quite difficult because obviously we our parents' opinion plays a huge role in this. But it's really important to try and have a think for yourself, do I actually want this? Or am I just doing it because either A, someone else is telling me to, or B, I haven't spent the time to actually figure out what I want? One thing that I constantly remind myself when I compare myself to others, or when I somehow feel that someone has something better than me, is a quote from a guy called Naval Ravikant. And he says, "Desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want." And if you think about it, it rang very true to me, because the moment we want something, instantly there's a gap in between, right? We don't have it, I want it. So now I either have to work to get it, or I'm going to be unhappy about the fact that I didn't get it. Now, look, we all need things, right? We all aspire to things. The important thing is aspire to something that you genuinely want, that you would be willing to be unhappy about for a long period of time, but would still feel content at the end, whether you got it or not. Because again, it's about enjoying the process. And I think also that links to how you frame your goals, right? A lot of students will, as part of their identity, it'll be like, I am going to get this particular ATAR. I'm going to get this study score. I'm going to enter this course at uni. The problem with those goals is they're binary, right? If you are a percentage point off on your ATAR, you've technically failed. If you get a study score that's 2 less than what you prescribed, you failed. But if you instead make it about the behaviors, for example, I'm not going to specify an ATAR, but what I am going to do is I'm going to make sure I don't repeat the same mistake twice. I'm not going to aim for a particular study score goal set in stone, but I'm going to make sure I ask stupid questions when I don't understand something. I think when you frame your goals around behaviors, the inputs, rather than the outcomes, which are binary, I think number one is leaves you much more content, right? You don't get this constant, voice and like this idea of suffering that you mentioned earlier. But number two, I think it's just a much more sustainable way to live life, especially when so many things can be out of our control. So really important, I think, curating our identity and actually finding what we value and what we want is so crucial as part of the mental game of VCE.
So just leading on from one of the points you mentioned earlier, Sachin, you said that there's all these external factors separate to the student's identity itself that can influence their VCE performance. Now, one thing that's related to that, which I've seen a lot in terms of a mindset story, is that there's students out there who have these external factors. So maybe their teacher or their school, their textbook, whatever, and they are stuck in this mindset that because of those external factors, they can't perform at a certain level, right? They start blaming those things, saying, oh, my teacher can't teach, therefore I can't get this study score, or my textbook's terrible, I can't get this study score, or the resources that I have are terrible, so I can't get the study score, right? And what this ends up creating mentally is this invisible ceiling, right, that you're capping yourself by. If that's the way you're thinking about things, that's the way it's going to turn out, right? If you're thinking, okay, I can't get the score, you're not going to get that score. It's that simple. So it's super, super important that you realize that these external factors, sure, they exist. Sure, some students will have those things happen to them. They'll have a teacher who doesn't teach, or they'll have a terrible textbook, whatever. But you've got to work beyond that, break through that barrier and realize, hey, I'm in this situation. What can I actually do to solve this problem? It's on me, right? Because no one's going to come and save you, right? There's no sort of angel out there, oh, where are the VC students who need help? Let me go, right? You got to break out of it yourself. So the first step in doing that is realizing that, yes, even though these limitations may exist, there are things you can do. Now, we live in a very modern digital age. Anything and everything is accessible on the internet, right? Let's say your teacher didn't teach you, let's say transcription, right? Simple by example. That doesn't mean you can't figure it out on your own, right? Simple Google search. There's YouTube videos. There's endless YouTube videos on this sort of stuff. Utilizing those resources, which are free and widely accessible, allows you to go beyond what your teachers taught you, go beyond what's on the textbook, and actually feel confident in that content, right? So at the end of the day, there's really no excuse, right? Students end up using these things like the teacher or the textbook, whatever, to justify things like poor organization, poor planning, poor commitment, poor discipline, right? And they use those things to actually avoid looking at themselves and realizing, hey, maybe it's me, right? It's not my teacher, it's not my textbook, it's just me. So if you find that you're in that situation, consider what are the things I can do? How can I solve this problem? How can I get out of this rut and make sure that I still succeed, right? Because at the end of the day, it's your VC journey, right? You are the student going through it. So you've got to do everything that you can to make sure that you can get whatever result you're hoping for at the end of the day. Now, things like YouTube, like I said, super useful place to go to. Khan Academy, that's another great resource. I personally use that as well when I was in VCE because they have really good simplified explanations of processes. They have some really nice diagrams on there. And once again, it's all free. And these days with AI, it's so easy to teach yourself something, right? Lots of students, I feel like, use AI in the wrong way. They use it to give them answers or just write an essay for them, something like that. Whereas the true power in it exists in the teaching, right? You can get AI to basically explain and teach any concept to you on this planet in a way that you can understand for free, right? ChatGPT is free. Like, sure, there's whatever usage limits or whatnot, but you can use it for the most part for free. So students need to realize that there's this abundance of resources out there, but it's on them to actually go out there and access it and not just fully shut down as soon as the teacher's not teaching the way that they hope for. So in summary, that mentality of just blaming others but not realizing that there are things that you can do is a huge limitation that lots of students find themselves in. So please realize that and break out of it.
So there you go. Those are the 4 key factors that play a part in having a good mindset during VCE. Hopefully you managed to learn something new and that you can take away to apply in your own routine. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you soon.